Well, Jay, both you and I have been watching from afar at BMG and admiring a lot of the work they're doing over there. We have some friends that work there as well. And you actually got a chance to sit down with someone very special from BMG this week.
Yeah, I did. I got to sit down with Dan Gill, and I just recently got to know Dan. We had coffee a little while back, and I really enjoyed talking to him about music and business. And, he's the EVP of Recorded Music West Coast for BMG. And for those who don't know, BMG is a beast. BMG is the fourth largest music company on the planet, and they do catalog acquisitions, and they do heritage artists, they do new and developing artists, they do publishing, they do a lot of things, and they do it really well. And it was really a pleasure for you and I to sit down with Dan. So now, without further ado, here's Dan Gill. Let it roll.
Stand by for transmission.
This is London calling.
Wake up! The revolution is at hand! Your morning coffee is on the air. 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 On the air.
Standing by.
Your morning coffee, the weekly music news for the new music business. It's the highly curated, agitated, advocated, moderated, and liberated digital music information that you need to know. We are your digital music authority. And now from our studios in Hollywood, California, here's your hosts, Jay Gilbert and Mike Etchart.
Dan, thank you so much for joining me today. It's good to see you.
Good to see you too, Jay. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I was really excited for this conversation. You and I had coffee not that long ago, and I felt like we could have talked for hours and hours. And I know we're busy, and we sort of have to, move things along. But for those with no prior knowledge, talk a little bit about BMG. What it is, and I mean, you guys are the fourth largest music company, and you guys are a player in so many different spaces, and I don't know if everyone really understands the different areas, whether it's publishing or country or, new frontline artists or, catalog art. You cover this world of music. Talk a little bit about BMG today.
Look, and I think, where BMG was, when I first started at the company 10 years ago, they re-entered the business. They were primarily in the publishing business, and it was a great business model because publishing was undervalued at that time. And I think the way the company was built with BMG's, their entry point getting back into the business, it was a very, very smart business move, right? And they were at that for probably 5 or 6 years before, in 2013, 14, they acquired a couple of catalogs. And then I think they were ready to enter, the recorded music business again, being more front facing. Vagrant Records was one of their, initial acquisitions, coming in with catalog and a team, right? So.
And isn't that where you came from?
Yes, I came from Vagrant Records, yes. And we were in acquisition in 2014, along with a couple of other smaller companies. We were really that first company in the US to come in with resources, with teams that could come in and effectively build that frontline recorded structure here in Los Angeles.
That's super exciting. You've been with BMG for over a decade now, as you mentioned, EVP of Recorded Music for West Coast. Talk about sort of your roles and responsibilities and your teams.
Look, I think first and foremost, our messaging is being that trusted partner, and having that transparency. We have very favorable deal structures for artists. Sort of what you see is what you get, you know. Our deals, range widely, but I think that's really important in having that conversation with an artist manager and the artist. There are so many options out there, and looking where the independent artists and that, where that community lies and what they are obviously looking for, because there's so much more information out there with the
Yeah.
internet and with social media platforms, and I think that's incredibly important. And for artists that are coming off of, whether it's a major label or independent label, there are a lot of options, but I think first and foremost, and even where I come from and how I've evolved in this business and what I've learned and, working with artists, I think that really at the highest level is to be that most trusted partner for artists and really at the end of the day help them build a sustainable career and really maximize the value of their music.
Yeah, you've got this reputation. We talked about this before we hit record, that you have this reputation, BMG does, as well as you, of, this emphasis on transparency, fairness, and that sort of is counterintuitive to the record industry.
Yeah, I think that's all you have, even personally or professionally with your career, and then what you stand for, and then what the company like. That's really that's really all you have, right? I mean, you want to, from start to the deal side to being able to pay your artists, and be able to collect and be able to have that very transparent relationship.
Yeah. Talk about how you've seen the business evolve. You've been around a little while, with Mammoth, Vagrant, BMG. You've seen a lot. We've gone from, ownership to access in a lot of different ways. Now we're talking about AI and all these different things. Talk about just all the things that you've seen since you started out until today.
I mean, when I entered the business, this is in the early 90s, we were at the peak of the physical era, right? I guess it wasn't quite the peak, but back in the early 90s, you had the CD. It was a premium configuration. It sounded better. And then, it was this explosion. Forget about the frontline side, it was this explosion of catalogs. So you had consumers replacing their vinyl and cassette. So the amount of revenue and money coming in just on that side of it was just incredible, experiencing that. So, I think that was a big part of it. You still had the gatekeepers in place, right? It was very much controlled terrestrial radio, the big box retailers, the emergence of Best Buy and those other retailers that, the circuit cities and all of that. And then you had really MTV, which was the biggest radio station in the world that, along with terrestrial radio that were breaking records, So myself and being at an indie, and being able to compete in that space was, it was still very challenging because it was really expensive, to get an artist off the ground, your cash flow. And, when you had something going on, how did you manage that, So that was like, that's where it was. And then when I went to Vagrant, I think that time it was the most tumultuous time, in the industry because you had the emergence, really the digital download revolution, right? We
Yeah.
were all turned, it was a head turner. It was really the biggest disruptor, of that time period. And being there and coming from where things were, physically, and then entering this part of the business, we were going through that transition. I think, iTunes and Apple, that really, I think, bought us time more than anything. I think it did establish a new configuration, but I think, we all saw the writing on the wall. There was a timeline on that. The revenues still were not where physical was. There still was that physical configuration that was still driving a lot of the business. But I think we all knew as an industry where things were potentially growing because it was still devolving. At that time,
Yeah.
I think we all saw that.
Yeah, 100%. You just talked about getting artists off the ground. And I kind of think that that's the toughest lane in the music industry, is that going from 0 to 60, because there's so much competition today. Your company is different than a lot of companies in that, you're doing catalog acquisitions, you're doing heritage artists, you're doing publishing, you're doing all these, superstar artists, you're doing all of that, but yet you still are focusing on artist development and going from 0 to 60. Talk a little bit about the challenges there, especially today with social media and short form video and influencers and all that stuff. Talk about those challenges.
I mean, look, I think it moves, 100 miles an hour, just in terms of, what are those digital trends? What's working? It's burner accounts, it's clipping, it's clips now, it's all of that. But look, I think it ultimately starts with the artist. I think, you've got so much noise out there. Obviously, TikTok is still the number one platform for music discovery.
Yeah.
We went through this time and place, the emergence of TikTok, 2019, 2020, the way the algorithm was working. You had a lot of things going viral, right, on TikTok. I think, I think at that time too, going through the pandemic, what else were we going to do? We're on phones, we're on social media. Streaming is, is elevated or growing by double digits, for 3 or 4 years. You have the way the TikTok algorithm is going. It was almost this perfect storm for the industry, where you were just watching all of these, whether it's a new artist or a catalog artist going, viral. And it was a great time. The industry started like, let's start these new imprints. Let's hire all of these, people, new staff. We just need to, it's just all about volume. And I think it still is that the business model is somewhat, you have to have that volume. But, going back to the platforms, the social media platforms, you just have to invest in it. And I think it does start with the artists more than ever. Back in the day, the labels did everything. Give us your record. We'll do all the marketing. We will, take it to radio. We'll work all the stories, MTV and all of that. And now, I think it really takes that artist. The creativity has to be there, but it's the left brain. Being that artist, you have to have that left brain and that right brain. Understanding social media, you have to find that voice. You have to find, where you are and what you're most comfortable with as an artist. And authenticity is incredibly important. And then being able to use all of those tools and staying on top of that. But content strategy is everything. Where that goes and how it's being utilized, I think that's going to constantly evolve. And now you have the AI side of it as well. But, it's keeping up with the tools. The trend now is talking, is the burner accounts, and, are those working? But, you have these as an artist, you have these incredible platforms that are really not that expensive to really get back to, storytelling and narrative. I'm not sure, it starts and stops with music and having great music, but it's what is that narrative? What is behind that music? I think that's incredibly important, and being able to obviously utilize all these tools is really what you have to utilize as an artist.
Yeah, you've painted a good picture of BMG. Let's talk about Dan for a second. Everyone I've met in the music industry can recite, a few key people or moments in their career where a door was opened or someone trusted or challenged you, and it literally changed the course of your career. Can you share any moments like that in your career?
Well, I'm going to go back in time to my Mammoth Records days. I came in, back then I did retail promotion, and back then, independent retail and being an independent record label, that was your basis. That's where you started, You couldn't compete, either with the majors. You had the big box retailers. Getting off the ground, it was that was your focal point. They were that store network, the independent store network. They were a vehicle, a very large vehicle, and they were a megaphone in terms of how to get the word out on your artist, because record stores in those days, you would go to the record store, talk to the clerk, hear something in store, see, see a visual, whatever, a poster, a flat, or whatever. They were a go-to, in addition to college radio or the zine, to hear about those artists. And they were the most cost-effective way, to get your music out. So we had this artist, Juliana Hatfield, member of the Blake Babies, one of the first records I ever worked as an intern at Mammoth Records. And that was a big tipping point for the label. And I was doing retail promotion. We had, we built our campaign at the independent store level, and they saw my work, and Steve Balcom, I will give him props. He was the GM, and he put his trust in me and said, "Hey, I want to give you more responsibility. I want you to work, we're going to do an exclusive distribution deal. I want you to be involved in that. I want to start empowering you to take this record to the next level." And it was about talking to the music lands, the big box retailers. And that was a big tipping point, working with, what it was, Important Records, which became Red Distribution, which is now the Orchard now. And that was a huge that was a huge statement and a huge tipping point for me as far as where my career went, and elevated me, and from there, we did a joint venture with Atlantic Records. Juliana Hatfield, we did a joint venture. I worked closely with that, with Atlantic Records. It was just a huge growth period for my career, if that makes sense.
Yeah, very much so. How did you get into music? What were those first few albums or singles that you bought?
For me, look, I was the oldest in the family. I had no older brothers or whatever to look up to. And it really was a friend, 10 years old or whatever. And it was the older brother, who was really into music. He had the stereo system, he had the turntable, and we would sneak into his room, and it was 8 tracks. I mean, I'm really going back, back in those days, it was Tom Petty, the Talking Heads, Cheap Trick at Budokan, huge record, for me, back in the day, Squeeze, those types of records. And, I just fell in love with music, from there. And then, I would say in sixth or seventh grade, that friend, let's start a band, and we started a band. We were doing covers and all of that. And with the band, I think I was in like eighth grade. This is a funny story because this is sort of my evolution into punk rock and what I loved about it. And it wasn't even about the records. We played this charity event at a at our high school stadium, and we were doing like Neil Young covers and Petty covers and all of that. And there was this raucous band playing super high energy. They were called the Mannequins, and I'm playing, and I'm feeling like it gets, it was like April or May, the beginning of spring. And I feel this like heat, behind me. And I'm looking back, and this band has started a fire. They lit a car on fire. And I'm like, what is happening here? And we had to stop the show. The fire department had, fire extinguishers there or whatever. But I'm like, this is insane. I love this, danger. And I saw the band perform, and they had like mannequins on sticks, and they had this fan base. And I'm like,
Nice.
this is unbelievable. This is before I even listened to punk rock music. And then soon after, I played in another band. The guitar player, huge Ramones fan, Sex Pistols, the Clash, all of those bands, and that was it for me. And I just fell in love, and we started playing punk rock music.
Nice. You and I grew up on the same exact comfort food. I love all of those records. Talk about some of the first live shows that you went to.
It's not an exciting show, but in 1981 was my first show. It was the Doobie Brothers.
Yeah, it's still cool.
Yeah, and it was, I was what? I was like 11 years old or so, or 12. It was 81, Saratoga Performing Arts Center. And it was a big show. My first ever experience was like an amphitheater show,
Yeah.
and just hearing the sound like that, and the, just the volume and the everything going on, and looking at the people. And my friend's parents, it was pretty funny. My friend's parents and his mom, it's the same friend that his brother, where we discovered this music and how, I got into music. She's like, what is that smell? Is that incense burning?
Yeah, I think we know it was burning.
But it was, obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was that, and then, I grew up in a small town in the Hudson Valley near Woodstock, New York. So we were very limited to the shows that we would go down to. So the Civic, the Mid-Hudson Civic Center was really the place at my age I could go to, whether you were chaperoned by your parents or whatever. I was at Twisted Sisters first, their early days. I was at the show where I think they got signed from Atlantic because Dee Snider announced, hey, we just signed to Atlantic Records, because they were an independent art, they were an independent,
Yeah.
Yeah,
So, absolutely.
That was big for me. And then really the big show in I think it was like 85, I saw the Ramones at JB's Theater in Albany, and that was it for me. My first punk rock show, I was pogoing the whole thing, snuck out of my window at my parents' house. We drove up to Albany, and, that was just such a memorable show for me.
Yeah, they're so much fun live. Working in the music industry, you get a lot of music that goes across your desk over the years. And sometimes it's about timing. Sometimes it's about who they have a relationship with or management. Sometimes bands don't necessarily pop, and people like us think, man, that band should have been huge. They should have been much bigger. I'm wearing a Jellyfish shirt. I love Jellyfish. Will Owsley, the Accidentals, whoever it is. There's certain artists that I go, man, these guys are amazing, and they should be bigger than they are. Have there ever been some albums or artists that came across your desk that you fell in love with and went, man, these guys should be bigger?
I mean, look, I go back to the 90s, just like you said, Jellyfish,
Sure.
My Bloody Valentine, the Breeders, Jeff, I guess Jeff Buckley, there's a lot of lore with him, and what
Yeah.
happened, but, the Elliott Smiths of the world, the Pavements, all of that.
Yes.
I guess, are you asking, with me working, why a specific record,
No, not necessarily why it happens, because, there's a ton of different reasons why. Just maybe some of those, like you just mentioned, Jeff Buckley, there's a documentary coming out that
Yeah,
I can't
I
wait to
saw that.
see. And, things like that where you're thinking, this is so good. Why wasn't this bigger? It just is.
I think you're right. I think it is timing, right? We had a band, right, at when I was at Mammoth Records, Machines of Loving Grace, right? And no one knows who that band is, right, today. But back in the early 90s, they were part of that sort of industrial movement following the footsteps of like what Trent was doing, with Nine Inch Nails, right? That movement. And Trent was a fan, right? This is part of our joint venture with Atlantic. They were incredibly talented. They had a story to tell. Scott, the singer, Scott was so, into lyrics. He was he had just so much substance behind the music, incredible players, marrying sort of the organic elements and electronic elements of what they were doing music wise. And, we got the band on radio. Radio back then was breaking the band, right? And I remember just being so passionate about this band. We had top 5 phones, at K-Rock. And this song, Butterfly Wings, was really growing. And, we had a joint venture with Atlantic Records. And, the politics of the major labels. And I think they just had other priorities. We couldn't get enough records into stores. We couldn't get enough records into the indie stores. I thought this record was a smash. My coworkers, people I would talk to, in the industry, and I just go back and, what goes behind the scenes and why certain bands have, made it and certain bands have not made it. And there's other circumstances, but that's an example of being, involved in a band, where it didn't work.
Yeah. Well, as we wind down here, I wanted to ask you about sort of the next 5 years. If you could get out your crystal ball, what sort of trends do you think are going to shape the future of what you do, whether it's music rights management, distribution, label, all these things? If you can peer into that, crystal ball, what do you think some of those trends may be?
A few are obvious, right? Look, I think AI is going to play a part of our business. We're investing in it. I think, there is a TBD on how labels get involved. On the creative side of it, you're hearing some, rights holders are starting to dabble with these AI music generators. We'll see where that goes. But I think in terms of AI efficiencies, helping us with our data, analytics, how can it help us, determine predictive analysis with our marketing efforts.
Yeah.
I think that's where that could be huge for us. In terms of back end, the back office, efficiencies and royalty, all of that. I still think, our philosophy here at BMG, it's got to start with a human and then end with a human. I think that's incredibly important. The human touch is still has to be there. Technology enhances creativity, but the people the humans still have to remain at the center.
Yeah. Dan, it's such a pleasure talking to you, and I'm honored that this is your first podcast, and I can't wait for our next coffee.
That sounds great. Thanks so much, Jay.
Thanks again, Dan. Appreciate you.
You've been listening to Your Morning Coffee, the weekly music news program for the new music business. Join Jay Gilbert and Mike Etchart next time for the digital music news you need to know.